I can't believe she wants me now.
She just wanted to send a silly photo to her best friend. Short pajamas, hair up, Friday night, no big deal. Except the name on the screen wasn't her friend's, it was his. Alex Mancini, her boss, the heir to one of the most dangerous families in Boston. She expected an awkward reply, maybe silence. What she didn't expect was the knock on her door. He was standing right there. Dark suit, hands in his pockets, that smile that never meant anything good. "You called for me," he said, walking in without asking. "So I came." Nina should have sent him away, should have locked the door, should have deleted the message and pretended nothing ever happened. But some things, once opened, don't close again. And Alex Mancini wasn't the kind of man who lets himself be ignored twice. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform. Completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1. The Wrong Message. Friday had a very specific smell of cheap freedom, the hot air rushing out through the Dorchester subway door at 6:47 in the evening, mixed with the scent of frying oil from the Vietnamese restaurant on the corner. I stepped off at the station with my shoulders locked up and my bag weighing on me like I was carrying rocks instead of a laptop, and 3 financial reports I'd reviewed so many times the numbers were already dancing behind my eyelids every time I blinked. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator, which meant every Friday I climbed those stairs with the dramatic conviction that it would be the last time. It never was. I turned the key, pushed the door open with my hip, and dropped everything on the floor by the entrance without ceremony, because there was no one to impress, and I'd given up pretending I was organized at least 2 years ago. I got out of the shower, pinned my hair up, and put on the pajamas Soraya had given me for my last birthday. Short, wine-colored satin, with a card that read, "For the woman who's been sleeping in an old t-shirt since 2019, enough." It made absolutely no sense for someone who was going to sleep alone watching reality show reruns, but it was pretty, and every time I put it on, it felt like I was giving myself a gift I'd never have the nerve to buy on my own. I threw myself onto the couch and grabbed my phone with that very specific Friday night energy. I opened the camera, tilted the phone at an angle that caught the lamplight just right, and took a photo. It was nothing special, just me, hair up, satin pajamas, barefoot on the couch with the face of someone who'd survived another week. The kind of photo you send your best friend with a stupid caption just to get a laugh. I typed the message without thinking, "I'm waiting for you at my place tonight," because that was our joke. Soraya was always saying she'd show up at my door with wine and gossip, and I was always saying I was waiting, and neither of us ever showed up because we had the social energy of 2 elderly cats. I hit send with my thumb and dropped the phone on my chest, closing my eyes. 3 minutes later, the phone rang. Soraya. "You bitch." "I saw the pajamas," she said, already laughing. "You look amazing. I have an insane talent for gifts. Write that down." "Did you call just to compliment yourself?" I asked, smiling with my eyes still closed. "I called because I have nothing to do, and you're my only friend who picks up on the first ring, which says a lot about both of us. But wait, send me the photo. I want to see it properly." "Did you send it in our chat?" The smile froze on my face. I opened my eyes slowly, with that kind of forced calm that shows up when the brain hasn't processed the disaster yet, but the body already knows. I picked up the phone, opened the messaging app, and the floor of my apartment ceased to exist. The photo wasn't in my conversation with Soraya. It was in my conversation with Alex Mancini, my boss, the Mancini family heir, the man who had texted me at 4 in the afternoon, asking for the weekly consolidated report, and whose name, because of that goddamn message, sat exactly 1 line above Soraya's in my conversation list. "Nina?" Soraya called. "Did you die?" "Soraya," I said, and my voice came out in that tone that precedes natural disasters. "I sent the photo to the wrong person." A second of silence. Then, to who? Alex Mancini. What followed was the loudest, most high-pitched, and most genuinely desperate sound of laughter I've ever heard come out of a human being. Soraya laughed with her whole body. I could hear her slamming some surface, probably the table, probably with her face. "Soraya, for the love of God." I sent a photo in short pajamas to my boss with the caption, "I'm waiting for you at my place tonight." The gravity of the situation didn't seem to reach her, because she kept laughing. "This isn't funny. I'm going to get fired. I'm going to get fired from a job I need to pay rent I already can't afford." "Girl," she gasped, trying to breathe between laughs. "You sent an invitation with a photo to the heir of a Mafia family. This isn't a firing. This is a movie script. I'm going to delete it." He already saw it. It says read. I looked at the screen. 2 blue check marks. He'd seen it. Alex Mancini, the man I avoided making eye contact with at the office, because every time I did I lost the thread of any rational thought, had opened that conversation, seen a photo of me in short pajamas on the couch, and read a message that said, with zero context and zero possible salvation, that I was waiting for him. I tried typing an explanation, deleted it, tried again, deleted again. Sorry, that was meant for someone else, and he'd think I was sending photos to another man. Wrong person, too cold. There was no dignified way out. Nina, breathe, said Soraya, who had finally stopped laughing enough to form words. Worst case, he ignores it, and you both pretend it never happened. Best case, he shows up at your door. That's not the best case, Soraya. That's a nightmare. For who? I hung up on her, not out of anger, because she was right and I couldn't stand to hear it. I sat on the couch for about 10 minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince my nervous system that this wasn't the end of my professional life. Maybe he'd laugh, maybe he'd ignore it. Alex Mancini was a busy man, a man who ran a chain of restaurants that everyone in Boston knew wasn't just a chain of restaurants, and he wasn't going to waste time on an accountant who couldn't even send a message to the right person. Then there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a timid knock. It was firm, spaced, with the rhythm of someone who doesn't have the habit of waiting. I froze on the couch. I looked at the door as if it could tell me who was on the other side, even though I already knew. My body knew before my head accepted it, because my heart took off at a speed that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the kind of trouble I couldn't seem to avoid. I got up, walked to the door, opened it. Alex Mancini was standing in the hallway of my elevatorless building in Dorchester, leaning against the doorframe like he belonged there. Dark suit, hands in his pockets, hair slightly disheveled in a way that looked deliberate, and that smile, that half-smile that never meant anything good, and that, for a reason I refused to examine, made my ribs tighten. You called for me, he said, his voice low and impossibly calm. So I came. I didn't call for you, I replied, and my voice came out higher than I would have liked. It was a mistake. The message was for Soraya, my friend. She gave me the pajamas, and I was going to send the photo to her, and your name was right above hers, and I tapped the wrong one and I was stammering. Me, Nina Sorel, who spent 8 hours a day organizing the numbers of an organization I knew wasn't what it pretended to be, couldn't finish a sentence in front of this man. I felt my face heat up as if someone had aimed a space heater directly at it. Alex said nothing while I fumbled. He just looked at me, and his gaze dropped for a second, quick, over the satin pajamas that suddenly seemed shorter than they were. When his eyes came back to mine, there was something there that made me forget the sentence halfway through. He took a step inside. I took a step back. He took another. I took another. And before I realized it, he was inside my apartment, and the door had closed behind him with a soft click that sounded way too loud in the silence. Alex, I started, raising my hand as if I could create a physical barrier between us. He caught my wrist, not with force, with precision, like someone who knows exactly how much pressure to apply so you stop moving without feeling pain. He pulled me slowly, closing the distance between us until my back was against the wall, and his body was close enough for me to feel the heat radiating through the fabric of his suit. His hand moved from my wrist to my face, his thumb touched the corner of my mouth, and I felt a current run down my entire spine, from the nape of my neck to the base. I should send you away, I murmured, but my voice came out without a shred of conviction. You should, he agreed, and his mouth was so close to mine I could feel the heat of every word. But you won't. And he kissed me. It wasn't a test kiss. It wasn't careful. It wasn't polite. It wasn't anything I would have imagined from a man like him. It was direct, deep, and loaded with an intent that knocked the air out of me. His hand held the side of my neck, thumb along my jawline, and his other hand slid to my waist, pulling my body against his with a firmness that told me, without words, he knew exactly what he was doing, and had thought about it more times than I suspected. My body answered before my head did. My hands grabbed the front of his suit and I kissed him back with an urgency that scared me, because I'm not that kind of person. I don't kiss my boss pinned against the wall of my own apartment on a Friday night. I don't lose control like this. But right then, in that moment, with the taste of him on my lips and the pressure of his body against mine, I couldn't find a single reason to stop, until I did. I pushed his chest with both hands. He stepped back, but not much, just enough to look at me, breathing hard and with that smile completely intact, as if I'd done exactly what he expected. Get out, I said, and this time my voice came out steady. Now, Nina, you're my boss, Alex. My boss. This is an abuse of power. It's a lack of boundaries. It's everything I won't accept. I'm not one of those women who come running when you snap your fingers. I sent a wrong message, a mistake, and you showed up here like it was an invitation. He listened, every word, leaned against the door with his hands back in his pockets, and that smile that now looked less like a provocation and more like something I couldn't name. You called for me, he repeated, with a calm that made me want to throw something at him. I came, and that kiss didn't lie. He opened the door, walked walked out and closed it behind him without waiting for an answer. I stayed right there, leaning against the wall where he'd had me pinned seconds before, heart pounding so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. I slid down to the floor, my back dragging against the wall, and sat there with my knees bent and my hands trembling in my lap. My phone buzzed. Soraya, did he show up? I didn't answer. I leaned my head against the wall and closed my eyes, trying to sort through the chaos inside my chest. My lips were still tingling. His cologne still hung in the air, something woody, expensive, that didn't belong in that apartment, and that, I knew, would stay soaked into my memory for much longer than I'd care to admit. I should have been angry, and I was, but beneath the anger, beneath the outrage, beneath everything I'd keep repeating to myself until I believed it, there was a truth I couldn't ignore. When he kissed me, I didn't want him to stop. And when he said the kiss hadn't lied, the most inconvenient part of me knew he was right. On Monday, I'd walk into the office, sit at my desk, open the spreadsheets and pretend none of it had happened. Pray that he'd do the same. That Alex Mancini, with all his business and problems and responsibilities, would simply decide that an accountant in a satin pajama set wasn't worth the effort. But something about the way he'd looked at me before leaving, that calm of someone who's in no rush because he already knows how the story ends, told me Alex Mancini wasn't the kind of man who pretends. Chapter 2. The Siege. Monday arrived with the delicacy of a freight train. I woke up at 6, stared at the ceiling for 20 minutes, and took a shower so hot my skin turned red, as if the water temperature could burn away the memory of Friday's kiss, along with the dead skin cells. It didn't work. I put on the most serious outfit I owned, black dress pants, blouse buttoned to the neck, hair pulled back tight, and left the house with the posture of someone heading to a courtroom rather than an office. La Corte sat in Back Bay, on a tree-lined street that smelled like old money. From the outside, a high-end Italian restaurant, dark stone facade, gold lettering on the door. On the inside, in the back, past the kitchen and up a discreet staircase, was the administrative office. 2 rooms, one for me, and another, larger, at the end of the hall, for him. I came in through the back door, greeted Marco, the chef who always arrived before everyone and was already checking the day's suppliers, went up the stairs, and pushed the office door open with my shoulder, while balancing my bag and a coffee I'd picked up on the way. The room was empty. His chair, visible through the half-open door at the end of the hall, was also empty. I sat down, turned on the computer, and let out a breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. 10 minutes. I had 10 minutes of peace. 10 minutes during which I opened the month spreadsheet, checked the pending entries, and almost managed to convince myself that maybe he'd decided to forget. That Friday's kiss was just an impulse, a reaction to an unexpected photo, and that Alex Mancini had more important things to deal with than chasing an accountant who couldn't even operate her own phone properly. Then he walked in. The sound of his footsteps came first, firm, spaced, with that cadence I already recognized without needing to turn my head. He came through the office door without knocking, as he always did, because Alex Mancini didn't knock on doors that were already his. Gray suit, tailored to perfection, with a white shirt underneath and no tie, a coffee in his right hand, and that calm, controlled smile that could mean anything between good morning and I know exactly what you're trying to do, and it's not going to work. Good morning, Nina, he said, as if it were any other Monday, as if Friday had never existed. Good morning, I replied, without taking my eyes off the screen. He leaned against the doorframe, lifted the coffee to his lips, and drank, without hurry. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck like a physical thing, a warm weight that settled between my shoulders and ran down my spine. I need the consolidated report for all 3 restaurants by Wednesday, he said. The margins at Nero dropped 2 points last quarter. I want to know if it's operating costs or lost revenue, professional, direct, without a single trace of the man who had pinned me against a wall and kissed me until I lost the ability to think. By Wednesday, I repeated, writing it down. I'll need the updated statements for the operating accounts. Last month's came in incomplete. I'll talk to Renan. He manages the financial logistics for all 3. Renan Voss. The name was familiar. I saw him in the halls of La Corte often. A man in his early 30s with an easy smile and the demeanor of someone who made a point of being pleasant to everyone. The Mancini's captain of operations, responsible for all the logistical movement across the restaurants. He always greeted me by name, which I thought was polite the first week, and slightly calculated from the second one on. Alex pushed off the doorframe and left without adding anything. No provocation, no double meaning, no mention of pajamas or wrong messages. And I should have felt relief. I should have thought, good, he understood. Let's move on like adults. But what I felt was irritation, an irrational, hot, and completely unjustifiable irritation at him for acting with the exact maturity I'd wanted him to show. Because a part of me, the stupid part, the part that still tasted him whenever I ran my tongue across my lips, wanted him to say something, anything, so I could react, push back, create distance. His silence left me with nothing to fight against, and that was worse than any provocation. Throughout the morning, I noticed, Alex hadn't forgotten. He hadn't moved on. He'd changed strategies. The first sign was subtle. He passed by my office 3 times in 2 hours, always with a reason. A question about Il Sangue, a document that needed a signature, a comment about the accounting software I used. Legitimate reasons, none of which required him to stop in the door frame and linger there longer than necessary, shoulder against the wood and eyes on me while I talked. The second sign came after lunch. I usually went out to eat at a cafe 3 blocks from La Courte. I sat at the corner table, ordered my usual, and opened my phone to answer the 14 messages Soraya had sent since 7 that morning, all variations of, "So, did he say anything?" and, "If he pretends nothing happened, I swear I'm going to that restaurant in person." I was typing a reply when the chair across from me moved. I looked up. Alex sat down like the chair was already his. Without asking, without a heads up, without the slightest ceremony. He set a coffee on the table, not for himself, for me, and leaned back with the ease of someone who occupies any space as though the space had been built around him. "Coincidence," he said. "You don't live in this neighborhood. You don't eat at cafes, and you probably don't know what a wrap is," I replied, looking at him with a raised eyebrow. "It's not a coincidence." His smile widened. Not much. Just enough for me to know my answer was exactly what he expected. "The coffee you order here is terrible," he said, gesturing toward the paper cup in my hand with a slight nod of his chin. "Tomorrow I'll bring you a real one. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I'm going to." He stayed for less than 10 minutes. He didn't try to talk about Friday. He didn't flirt in any obvious way. He asked about the report, made a comment about the revenue drop at Nero that showed he actually understood the numbers, and left with the same ease he'd arrived with. But when he was gone, I noticed the coffee he'd left on the table was hot, came from an Italian roastery I could never afford on my salary, and matched my taste in a way that wasn't luck. He knew how I took my coffee. I had never told him how I took my coffee. The next morning, when I arrived at the office at 8:15, there was a cup of coffee on my desk, hot, from the same roastery, with a note on a post-it stuck to the side, in slanted, steady handwriting, "No sugar with cinnamon." Am I getting better? I tucked the post-it into the drawer before anyone could see. I didn't respond. I drank every last drop. The text started that afternoon. The first one arrived at 3:16, while I was checking Il Sangue's balance sheets. "That coffee you order at that cafe is an insult." I ignored it. The second came 15 minutes later. "If you tell me you like theirs better than what I brought, I'll take that as a personal betrayal." I bit my lip to keep from laughing. The third, at 4:05. "The report is due Wednesday." "But the coffee is forever," I replied before I could think. "Are you always this dramatic about coffee?" His answer was instant. "Only when the person drinking it is stubborn enough to prefer bad coffee out of pride." I closed my phone, opened it again, closed it, pushed it to the corner of the desk and went back to the numbers. But the numbers didn't make sense anymore because I was smiling, and the worst part was that the smile had shown up without asking permission. On Thursday, Soraya showed up at the cafe unannounced, cornered me with a green juice and a list of evidence she counted off on her fingers. The imported coffee, the post-it in the drawer, the blouse buttoned to the neck. Her conclusion: "This isn't harassment, it's fate with a business license." I tried to argue that convenience wasn't fate, but the only thing that came out was a correction about which day of the week the coffee had started showing up, because apparently my only defense was correcting irrelevant details. She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a trial. That same afternoon, something shifted at the La Courte office, but not between me and Alex. The shift came from somewhere else. Alex was in a meeting in the back room with Tav, Giancarlo, and 2 men I'd never seen before. Tav, Ottavio Saldari, Alex's right hand since they were teenagers, was easy to spot. Tall, silent, with the kind of presence that made people clear the way without him having to ask. Giancarlo Ferro, the family consigliere, was the visual opposite. Thin, gray hair combed back, thin-rimmed glasses, and the bearing of a lawyer who knew more secrets than any priest. I didn't know what they were discussing, but the door was closed, and the faces I'd seen going in weren't the faces of people about to talk about menus. I was in my office when I saw, through the half-open door, Tav watching Alex from across the table. Alex had his phone in his hand, and it was the 3rd time in 10 minutes he'd looked at the screen. Tav tilted his head, crossed his arms, and said, in that dry voice only he could make sound both neutral and razor-sharp at the same time, "If the phone explodes from you staring at it, that's on you." Alex slipped the phone into his suit pocket without a word. Tav didn't say anything else, but I saw, for just a second, the corner of his mouth lift, a tiny, almost invisible smile, the kind that comes when you see something you didn't expect. And the look he gave Alex, before turning his attention back to the meeting, carried something I didn't expect to find there: recognition. As if he were watching, for the first time in years, his boss lose his composure, and found it more interesting than any deal on the table. The meeting ended. The men left. Alex came to my office, stopped at the doorframe I was beginning to associate with his presence, and stood there for a moment before saying, "Friday, dinner at Nero, the whole admin team. You're included. Is that an invitation or a summons?" I asked, without taking my eyes off the computer. "Depends. Which one gets you to come?" I didn't answer. He left. And I was left with the certainty that my strategy of pretending everything was normal was failing spectacularly, because my heart was racing again, and I had no one to blame but myself. I went home that night with my head full of him and furious about it. I tossed my bag on the couch, opened the laptop out of habit, and did what I always did when I needed to stop thinking about something. I buried myself in work. I opened Il Sangue's spreadsheets, started checking the entries for the last 3 months to get a head start on Alex's report, and let the numbers fill the space he kept insisting on invading. That's when I saw it. At first it didn't seem like anything. A figure in the March statement that didn't match what I had in the system. A small difference. The kind of thing that could be a posting error or a rounding issue. But I was good at this. That's what they paid me for. And when something didn't add up, my instinct wasn't to ignore it. It was to pull the thread. I pulled. The March discrepancy repeated in February and in January. Not the same amounts, but the same pattern. Small transfers going out of Il Sangue's operating account to an account I didn't recognize. Amounts low enough not to trigger automatic alerts, but frequent enough that, added together, they amounted to a sum that was anything but insignificant. I opened Nero's records. Same pattern. Subtle transfers, irregular intervals, amounts that didn't correspond to any vendor in the system. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen with the kind of calm that appears when the adrenaline is so high, the body decides to freeze instead of react. I knew what this meant. It wasn't an error. It wasn't rounding. Someone was siphoning money from inside the Mancini operation. Someone with access to the operating accounts. Someone who knew the systems well enough to hide the trail from anyone who wasn't looking carefully. I closed the file, shut the laptop, went to bed, but I lay awake for over an hour, staring at the ceiling of the dark bedroom, with the feeling that I had just seen something nobody wanted me to see, and that from now on, pretending I hadn't was going to get a lot harder. Chapter 3: Crossfire. I spent the entire weekend trying not to open the laptop. It lasted until Saturday at 2 in the afternoon, which, considering my track record of self-control when it came to work, was already a record. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold coffee and the spreadsheets open, and did what I knew how to do best. I followed the numbers. I didn't want to be the new accountant who shows up with conspiracy theories after 2 months on the job. But numbers don't lie, and what someone had done in there was getting clearer with every statement I opened. The pattern I'd already found at Il Sangue and Nero now had a shape. Every 11 to 14 days, a transfer between $3,000 and $6,000 left the operating accounts for a corporate account that didn't exist in any vendor registry. Someone had created an invisible drain and was counting on the fact that nobody would look closely. But I looked, and now I couldn't stop looking. I closed the laptop on Sunday night with a list of dates, amounts, and questions that had no answers. I saved everything in an encrypted folder and tried to sleep, but sleep came full of numbers dancing behind my eyelids as if they were laughing at me. On Monday, I got to La Courte earlier than usual. The office was still empty. The hallway light flickered with that lazy rhythm of a fluorescent bulb nobody bothered to replace. I sat down, opened the system files, and started cross-referencing the data I'd pulled over the weekend with the internal records. I needed to confirm one thing: who had direct access to the operating accounts for Il Sangue and Nero? The list was short. Giancarlo had general access as consigliere. I had read-only access as the accountant. And Renan Voss, as captain of operations, had full access. He was the one who authorized vendor payments, approved logistical transfers, and managed the day-to-day cash flow. Renan. The name kept pulsing in my head as I closed the files, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions without more data. Accusing someone inside that organization wasn't like reporting fraud at a normal company. There, accusations had consequences that went far beyond firings and lawsuits. I heard footsteps in the hallway and closed the separate spreadsheet by instinct, switching back to the report Alex had asked for. The footsteps stopped. I looked up. Alex was in the hallway, less than 6 feet from me, with a cup of coffee in his hand, and his tie loosened at the neck, as if he'd started his day hours before showing up there. The dim hallway light cut across his face in a way that made the angles sharper. The jawline, the shadow under his eyes, the crease between his brows that appeared when he was thinking about something he had no intention of sharing with anyone. "You're early," he said, leaning his shoulder against the hallway wall. "I have a report due Wednesday, remember?" I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "Some of us actually have to work for a living." The corner of his mouth lifted. He took a step toward me, and that step changed everything, because suddenly the conversation wasn't about schedules or reports anymore. It was about the distance between us getting smaller by the second, without me making a move to increase it. "The report could have waited until 9, he said, and his voice dropped half a tone, taking on that deep texture that made me lose my train of thought. "But you're here at 7:30, in an empty hallway. Coincidence?" I used the same word he'd used at the cafe, and by the way his eyes lit up, he noticed. Alex moved closer. His cologne reached me first, woody, with a note of leather I already associated with the danger of being too close. His hand moved, and for a second I was sure he was going to touch my waist. His fingers passed so close to the fabric of my blouse I felt the heat before the touch, but the touch never came. His hand picked up the report sitting on the desk beside me, and he stepped back with the ease of someone who never intended to do anything else. "Thanks," he said, holding a piece of paper he didn't even need. I knew that he knew, and he knew that I knew, and still neither of us said a thing, because naming it meant not being able to pretend it didn't exist anymore. I left the hallway with my heart pounding in my ears, and angry at myself for shaking over a touch that never happened. That's what Alex Mancini did. He didn't need contact to throw you off balance. The promise of it was enough. The possibility, the space between intention and action, charged with an electricity that clung to the skin like static. At lunchtime, Soraya showed up unannounced. She walked into the usual cafe, sat across from me, and set a paper bag on the table with 2 sandwiches and a bottle of iced tea, as though she were setting up camp. "I brought food because last time you spent the whole meal twisting your napkin instead of eating, which means the situation got worse," she said, pushing one of the sandwiches toward me. "The situation didn't get worse. Nina, you've got dark circles, a blouse buttoned to the neck, and fidgety hands. That's the emotional chaos trifecta. I've seen this clinical picture before and the diagnosis is always the same." I bit into the sandwich so I wouldn't have to answer, but Soraya didn't need answers. She was perfectly capable of carrying a conversation by herself. "Is he still sending coffee?" she asked. "Every day. And texts?" "Sometimes." "And you answer?" I hesitated for a second. Soraya pointed at my face with her index finger. That pause said it all. "You answer." "The woman who swore she was going to ignore him is answering texts from the Mafia boss at 3 in the afternoon. I'm going to need more tea to process this." I almost laughed, but I didn't have time, because what happened next erased any lightness Soraya's conversation had brought. I returned to La Courte after lunch and climbed the stairs toward the office. The second-floor hallway had a turn before reaching my room, and it was at that turn that I stopped, because I heard a voice I recognized, but in a language I didn't expect. Renan Voss was at the end of the hallway, near the window overlooking the restaurant's side alley, phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking French. His posture was different from what I saw day to day, shoulders tense, head down, his free hand gripping the edge of the windowsill hard enough to turn his knuckles white. I didn't speak French fluently, but I'd taken 2 semesters in college and understood enough to catch fragments. I heard Durand, clear as a bell. I heard les montants, the amounts. And I heard, before he lowered his voice even further, and I lost the rest, something that sounded like la prochaine livraison, the next delivery. Renan hung up. I backed away from the turn in the hallway and ducked into my office before he could see me, sitting in the chair with the forced ease of someone who'd been there the whole time. He passed by the door seconds later, saw me, and smiled in that same cordial way as always. "Good afternoon, Nina. Busy day?" "The usual," I replied, with a smile that took an enormous effort to keep on my face. He moved on. I waited until the sound of his footsteps disappeared down the stairs before letting out my breath. Durand. Renan was talking to someone connected to the Durands, the rival family that controlled the port of Boston, and that the Mancinis treated as a direct threat, and he was talking about amounts and deliveries, on the phone, in the middle of the Mancini office, as if that hallway were a safe place for that kind of conversation. I had 2 pieces of information now, the transfers in the books, and Renan's call, and both pointed in the same direction, with a clarity that made me nauseous. The afternoon passed as if I were underwater. The numbers on the screen didn't make sense. The words in the report seemed scrambled, and every time someone walked down the hall, I felt my stomach clench. I left the office at 6 with a heavy head, and the feeling that I was carrying something far too dangerous for my own size. The parking lot behind La Courte was poorly lit after 5, and I usually crossed it quickly, but that night, I wasn't alone. Alex was leaning against the hood of a black sedan that wasn't mine, arms crossed, jacket off. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows and his tie had vanished at some point during the afternoon. He wasn't smiling. There was no provocation on his face, no calculated charm, none of that irony I already knew so well. He was serious in a way I hadn't seen yet, and this Alex was more intimidating than any previous version. "Nina," he said, and the tone of his voice made me stop in the middle of the parking lot. "What is it?" "The Durans are making moves. Things are going to get tense over the next few days. I need you to be careful." The sentence was simple, but the weight behind it wasn't. I knew about the rivalry between the families, only from what I could piece together from whispered conversations at the office and the tense faces that showed up at certain meetings. Nobody had ever looked directly at me and said I needed to be careful. "Why?" I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer. "Because you work for me," Alex said, and his eyes didn't leave mine. "And I take care of what's mine." The line was possessive, and in any other context I would have fired back with a sharp remark about not being anyone's property. But something in his tone held me back. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't control. It was fear. A real, restrained, disciplined fear. The kind of fear a man like Alex Mancini didn't allow himself to show to almost anyone. I stayed silent for a moment, and in that silence, I made a decision that would probably change everything. I could leave. I could thank him for the warning, get in the car, and keep pretending the numbers in the spreadsheet were someone else's problem. But I was tired of pretending. "I found something," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "In the books, there are transfers going out of the operating accounts for Il Sangue and Nero. Small amounts, frequent, to an account that doesn't exist in any vendor registry. It's been happening for at least 3 months. Alex didn't move. He didn't frown, didn't cross his arms, didn't make a single gesture that gave away what he was thinking. But I saw the change in his eyes, as if a door had shut behind them, and the man standing there now was a colder, more calculated, more dangerous version than anything I'd seen before. "Who has access to those accounts?" he asked, with the calm of someone who already knew the answer was going to hurt. "Giancarlo, me, and Renan Voss," I answered. "Giancarlo has general access. I have read-only access. Renan has full access. He authorizes payments and manages the operational flow for all 3 restaurants." Alex went quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, the heavy silence of someone fitting together pieces he wished didn't fit. We both knew the list of suspects was short, and we both knew which name weighed heaviest on that list. "Go home," he said at last, and his voice had recovered that tone of command that left no room for negotiation. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. Alex, Nina, go home." I went, not because he told me to, but because I recognized, in the tension of his jaw and the way he was already reaching for his phone before I turned around, that something had just shifted, that the information I'd handed over was bigger than I'd imagined, and that from here on out, he was going to handle it the way men like him handled betrayal, in a way I probably didn't want to witness. I drove to Dorchester on autopilot, hands steady on the wheel, and my mind somewhere far away. I parked in front of the building, got out of the car, and walked to the entrance. That's when I saw it. On my doorstep, propped against the baseboard as if someone had placed it there with care, was a bouquet of flowers. Red roses, dark, almost wine-colored, tied with a black ribbon, and with no card, no envelope, no note, no sender. I picked up the bouquet with ice-cold hands and counted the roses by instinct, the kind of stupid habit I didn't know I had until that moment. 11. There were 11 roses in a bouquet that clearly should have had 12, 1 flower short. I didn't know what it meant, not in that instant. But something about that wrong number, that deliberate absence, made my stomach clench with a force that no spreadsheet, no report, and no French phone call had managed to provoke. Because wrong numbers, I understood those. Wrong numbers were my job, and that number was wrong on purpose. I went inside the apartment, locked the door, and set the bouquet on the kitchen table, where it stared back at me for the rest of the night like a question I didn't know how to answer. Chapter 4. The Fall. The fall I called Alex at 11 at night, not because I wanted to, because the bouquet of 11 roses was sitting on my kitchen table staring at me like a warning, and I couldn't sleep, knowing someone had climbed 3 flights in my elevatorless building to leave that message at my door. He picked up on the second ring. He didn't say hello. He said my name, as if he already knew it was me, as if he'd been waiting. "The flowers," I said, and my voice came out more controlled than I felt. "Someone left a bouquet at my door. No card. 11 roses instead of 12. Silence. Not a second of silence. Several. The kind of silence that has weight, that takes up space, that presses against the chest of whoever is on the other end of the line waiting for a reaction. I expected anger. I expected him to curse, to ask questions, to say something that would give me direction. But Alex didn't do any of that. He went quiet in a way that was worse than any shout, because the silence of a man who always has an answer for everything meant the situation was serious enough that even he needed a moment before acting. "Don't leave the house," he said at last, and his voice had lost any trace of warmth. It was pure instruction, no room for interpretation. "Tav will be there in 20 minutes. Alex, I don't..." He hung up. I sat on the bed with the phone in my hand, and the feeling that the apartment floor was slowly tilting, one flower short. I'd looked it up after locking the door, because that's what I did. When I didn't understand something, I researched until I did, and what I found made my stomach turn. In the old tradition of Italian families, a bouquet with one flower missing was a message, not a direct threat. A warning. "We know where you are. We're counting." In less than 20 minutes, there was a knock at the door. This time the knock was different from Alex's, shorter, drier, no rhythm. I opened it and found Tav in the hallway, wearing a dark coat over a black shirt with the posture of someone who didn't need a visible weapon to be intimidating. Behind him, on the street, a black sedan with tinted windows waited with the engine running. "Boss's orders," Tav said. No greeting and no explanation. "You're coming with me." "Where?" "His penthouse. Downtown." "I don't need a babysitter, Tav." He looked at me with that neutral patience of someone who's heard that line hundreds of times and knows how it ends. "I'm not a babysitter," he said. "I'm the person who makes sure you get there alive. The car's right there. Grab what you need." My phone rang before I could answer. "Alex." "Nina, someone left a mob message at your door." His voice was cutting and calm at the same time, like a blade wrapped in silk. "You can argue with me inside a secured apartment, or from the backseat of a car that's already on its way. Pick one." I looked at Tav. I looked at the empty hallway of my building, the third-floor light flickering, and the silence of the street drifting in through the hall window. I grabbed a bag, shoved in the laptop, a change of clothes, and my phone charger, and followed Tav down the stairs without another word. Tav drove in silence. Boston passed by the window like a blur of lights and wet asphalt, and in 15 minutes, we were at a building in the financial district. Understated facade, no name, elevator straight to the penthouse. I knew Alex had money. I saw the numbers every day, but knowing and seeing are different things. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing all of Boston, dark tones of wood and leather, the smell of cedar and coffee, lighting low enough to make the space feel more intimate than its actual size suggested. Tav left me at the entrance and disappeared without a goodbye. I stood there, bag in hand, looking at the space that belonged to the man I was supposed to keep my distance from. Alex appeared from a hallway at the back of the penthouse. No suit, shirt with the sleeves rolled up, barefoot, hair disheveled. He looked younger like that, more human, and that disarmed me more than any provocation ever had. "Did you eat?" he asked, and the question was so ordinary, so domestic, that it took me a second to process that he was the one asking it. "No," he nodded toward the kitchen. On the dark marble counter sat covered plates, glasses, an already open bottle of wine, and cloth napkins. A full dinner, prepared before I arrived, which meant that when he'd called and said Tav was on his way, he already knew I'd end up there. The control that man had over the events around him was both impressive and mildly unsettling. "You had this set up before I said I was coming," I said, sitting on the tall stool at the counter. "I had it set up when I saw your call," he corrected, uncovering one of the plates. "But I knew you'd come. Confident. Practical. You're too smart to stay in an apartment with no security after getting a warning like that." We ate, or rather, I ate, because I was starving, and the food was absurdly good, and he sat across from me with a glass of wine and watched me eat with an attention that under any other circumstance would have made me self-conscious. But there, in that kitchen, with the entire city glittering on the other side of the windows, and the adrenaline from the last few hours still running through my veins, I had no room for self-consciousness, only hunger, and the strange feeling that, for the first time in a long time, I was in a place where nobody was going to leave anything at my door without consequences. The conversation started with security, surveillance on my building, the Durans, the tension at the port. Briefing tone, matter of fact and emotionless, but the wine softened the edges, and somewhere between the second glass and the silence, the conversation slipped somewhere else. "My father believed trust was the greatest asset a boss could have," Alex said, turning the glass between his fingers with a slowness I already knew was his way of organizing his thoughts before letting them out. "He trusted the right people for years, and then he trusted the wrong person just once." I knew the story. Everyone who worked for the Mancinis knew, at least the official version. Dominic Mancini, the patriarch, had been arrested 3 years ago because of information leaked by someone on the inside. The trial was quick, the sentence was heavy, and Alex at 27 took over an organization that looked at him with a mix of expectation and doubt. It was an informant, Alex continued, and his voice lost the controlled cadence I knew. It dropped lower, closer to the surface, as if the words were being pulled from a place he didn't visit often. Someone who sat at my father's table, who had dinner at our house, who knew my cousins' names. I should have seen it. I was in the operation. I had access to the same data. I looked at that man every week and saw nothing. He stopped, took a sip of wine. When he continued, he didn't look at me. He looked at the city through the window, as if it were easier to tell Boston's lights than to tell me. I took over everything at 27. No preparation, no transition. Half the family thought I was too young. The other half was waiting for me to fail so they could take my place. And I did the only thing I knew how to do. I shut everything down. Shut down access. Shut down trust. Shut down any door that would let someone get close enough to do it again. The kitchen went silent. The kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled, that asks to be respected. I looked at him and saw something I'd never seen at the office, in the halls of La Courte, or in the parking lot. Exhaustion, not physical. The exhaustion of carrying alone a weight that wasn't made for one person. "You didn't make a mistake by trusting," I said, and the words came out before I decided to say them. "The one who betrayed you did." Alex turned his face toward me. His look was that of someone who'd just heard something he didn't expect, not because the sentence was complicated, but because it was too simple, too direct. The kind of thing no one said to him because everyone around him was too busy calculating how every word would affect them politically to just tell the truth. He didn't respond, but the way he looked at me, in silence, unhurried, with something deep in his eyes that looked like gratitude and surprise at the same time, said more than any word he could have chosen. The distance between us shrank without either of us moving in any noticeable way, or maybe I leaned in without realizing it, or maybe he did. What I know is that one moment we were sitting on opposite sides of the counter, and the next his hand was on my face, his thumb tracing a slow line from my cheekbone to the corner of my mouth, with the care of someone touching something he's afraid of breaking. The kiss, when it came, was different from any I'd known, different from the first one, which had been explosion and impulse. This one was slow, deliberate. His mouth found mine with a calm that made me understand that this time there was no excuse, no wrong message, no coincidence. Nothing between us to justify it other than the bare truth that we both wanted it. It was a choice. His and mine. His hand slid to the back of my neck and I felt his fingers close in my hair with a firmness that contrasted with the softness of his mouth. My body leaned toward him, as if answering its own gravity, and I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating hard beneath the fabric of his shirt. Too hard for a man who pretended to have everything under control. The phone rang. Alex stopped. His forehead rested against mine for a second. His heavy breathing mingled with mine, and I felt his frustration in the tension of the fingers still holding the back of my neck. He pulled away, took the phone from his pocket, and looked at the screen. "Tav," he said, more to himself than to me. He answered. I watched the change happen in real time, as if someone had flipped a switch. The man who a second before had been holding me with care disappeared, and in his place stood someone I recognized from the halls of La Courte, from closed-door meetings, from the looks that made grown men lower their heads. The head of the Mancini family, cold, calculated, voice dry and eyes emptied of anything that wasn't strategy. "When?" he said into the phone. Pause. "Are you sure?" Another pause. Longer. "Call Giancarlo. Now." He hung up, looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made me swallow hard. Because it wasn't anger, it was the absence of it. The ice-cold calm of someone who's already moved past anger and arrived at a decision. "The transfers," he said. "They run through Renan Voss's operating account." I said nothing. I didn't need to. The missing piece had just clicked into place. The transfers, the French phone call, the cordial smile that suddenly made a lot more sense. Alex picked up the phone again and called Giancarlo. The conversation was short, in Italian, and I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was a summons. Then he called another number and gave instructions I would have preferred not to hear, but heard anyway. Something about a meeting at La Courte that night, and about making sure Renan was there. I watched it all from the kitchen stool. Right there, for the first time, I was seeing all of Alex Mancini, not the sarcastic boss, not the man who'd shown up at my door in a suit. The man who, when he uncovered a betrayal, simply started moving pieces with the precision of someone who knew that hesitating was more dangerous than acting. I should have felt afraid, and I did. A part of me was screaming that this wasn't for me, that I was an accountant from Dorchester, not a piece on that chessboard. But the part that had felt his heart pounding beneath his shirt didn't move. move. I stayed. Alex left for La Corte with Tav shortly after midnight, and I stayed at the penthouse with instructions not to leave and not to open the door for anyone. But instructions were never my strong suit, and when my phone buzzed an hour later with a text from Tav saying Renan had arrived at the restaurant, I was already grabbing my coat. La Corte was closed at that hour. The dining room lights off, the tables empty, the smell of food replaced by the cold silence of a space that wasn't meant to be empty. I came in through the back door, which Tav had left unlocked, and went up the stairs to the second floor. I heard the voices before I saw anything. The meeting room door was ajar. Through the gap, I could see the long, dark wood table where menus and vendors were normally discussed. Now, on one side, sat Alex, Tav, and Giancarlo. On the other, alone, with his smile gone and sweat glistening on his forehead, sat Renan Voss. The transfers leave accounts you manage. Alex's voice was neutral, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather, to a corporate account that doesn't exist in any of our records, for at least 3 months. Renan swallowed hard. Alex, this is a misunderstanding. I can explain. The operating accounts have automatic transactions that— Renan, Giancarlo cut in, with the coldness of someone who'd heard enough lies to recognize them on the first breath. Don't insult our intelligence. Renan switched tactics. The smile vanished and was replaced by something more desperate, a mix of indignation and fear that he was trying to disguise as courage. The Durans offered what you never did, he said, lifting his chin. A stake, a voice. I've sat at that table for 4 years, and I was never treated as more than a glorified errand boy. You sat at that table because my father allowed it, Alex said, and this time his voice had lost every last trace of neutrality. It was low, steady, and loaded with something that made me clench my fists. And you used that seat to sell information about my family. Renan realized there was no way out. I saw it in his eyes, the exact moment the strategy shifted from defense to offense. He leaned forward, placed his hands on the table, and played his final card with the precision of someone who'd already rehearsed that moment. Your accountant knows more than she should, he said, looking straight at Alex. If I go down, she goes down with me. And if the Durans find out she's the one who found the transfers, it won't be a bouquet at her door next time. I stopped breathing. From the hallway, behind the half-open door, I felt my entire body go cold, not because of what he said, but because of the implication. He knew about the flowers, or he'd sent them, and he was using my name as a shield. Alex didn't blink, didn't raise his voice, didn't shift in his chair. He simply looked at Renan with that calm I now understood was his most dangerous version, the calm that came after the decision, not before. The accountant is under my protection, he said, and every word landed with the weight of a decree. And you won't be in a position to bring anyone down. The sentence hung in the air like a period at the end of a paragraph. Renan opened his mouth to respond, but Tav was already on his feet, and the mere sight of Tav standing was enough for the reply to die before it was born. Giancarlo made a brief gesture with his hand, and 2 men I hadn't noticed entered through the side door and positioned themselves beside Renan. Renan was taken away. There was no violence. Not there. Not in front of me. But the way he left, with his shoulders hunched and the look of someone who knows the world as he knew it just shrank drastically, told me that what came next wouldn't be so civilized. I should have stayed at the penthouse. I should have waited. But I was there, in the hallway, holding my breath with ice-cold hands, and when I turned to leave before anyone saw me, I came face to face with Alex. He was standing 3 feet from me, hands in his pockets, with the expression of someone who'd known I was there the whole time. You should have stayed upstairs, he said, and you should stop deciding where I stay, I replied, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, considering my hands were still shaking. He looked at me. The corner of his mouth moved, not a full smile, just the shadow of one, enough for me to know that despite everything, despite the traitor and the threats, and the world crumbling around him, that answer was exactly what he needed to hear. Almost smiled. Almost. We drove back to the penthouse in silence. In the car, with Tav behind the wheel and Boston passing by the window like a river of lights, neither of us said a word. But at some point, in the darkness of the back seat, his hand found mine. It didn't squeeze. It didn't pull. It just stayed there, warm, steady, present. And I knew, with the clarity of someone watching a door close behind them, that there was no going back. Chapter 5. What Remained. The days that followed had the quiet rhythm of someone picking up wreckage after a storm. Renan Voss vanished off the map, and I didn't ask how, because I'd learned in recent weeks that certain questions, in that world, weren't asked out loud. His name disappeared from the halls of La Corte, as if it had never existed, and the people who used to greet him with smiles started acting as though the space he'd occupied had been filled with air. Without the informant, the advantage the Durans had built evaporated. Alex didn't celebrate. I never saw him celebrate anything, actually, as if any show of relief were an invitation for the next threat. But the tension in his shoulders eased, the closed-door meetings became less frequent, and for the first time since I'd worked there, LaCourte seemed to breathe. On Wednesday, Alex called a meeting with the family. Giancarlo, Tav, Luca, Alex's younger cousin, impulsive, with too much energy for his own body, who served as messenger and lookout, and the remaining captains. They all sat at the long table in the meeting room, the same table where Renan had been confronted days before, and Alex announced two things. The financial structure would be rebuilt from scratch, and Nina Sorel would remain as head accountant, with full access to all accounts and full protection from the family. Giancarlo raised his eyebrows. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The distrust was written in the way he adjusted his glasses and clasped his hands on the table, the gesture of a lawyer who disagreed but respected the hierarchy enough to save his objection for a private conversation. Luca let out a low whistle, with a half smile that could have been either admiration or provocation. Tav stayed leaning against the back wall, arms crossed, and looked at Alex with a quiet respect he didn't try to hide. He didn't say a word, but his presence there, still and unshakable, was the clearest endorsement anyone could give. I wasn't in the meeting. I was in the office upstairs doing what I did best, fixing numbers. The books Renan had wrecked were a labyrinth of false figures, ghost transfers, and manipulated records that I was dismantling line by line, with the methodical patience of someone defusing a bomb using a spreadsheet. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, that cadence I already knew by heart, firm, spaced, unhurried. Alex stopped at the door and stood there, leaning against the frame that by this point I already considered his territory. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched me type, sleeves rolled to my elbows, and hair slipping out of its pin. I didn't look up, not because I didn't want to, because I wanted to too much, and that was the part that irritated me. "The meeting's over," he said. "And the verdict? You stay. Full access. How generous of you all, allowing me to keep doing the job I was already doing." The corner of his mouth moved, but the smile didn't land. He walked into the room, closed the door, and leaned against the edge of the desk facing me. The proximity was deliberate. Alex never did anything by accident, and the air between us immediately grew heavier. "You're angry," he said, not as a question. "I'm not angry at you," I replied, and it was true. I dropped my hands from the keyboard and finally looked at him. I'm angry at everything. At the situation, at the fear I felt, at having my life turned upside down in 2 weeks, without having had time to process any of it, at sitting here cleaning up someone else's mess while pretending everything's fine. Alex listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't minimize, didn't offer solutions. He just waited, with a patience I'd never seen in him, as if, for the first time, the man who controlled everything had decided to control nothing. "I'm not a piece on your chessboard, Alex," I said, and the sentence came out loaded with everything I hadn't said in the past few days. "I know," he answered, and his voice was low, without irony, without provocation, without any of the layers he used to keep the world at a distance. "You're the only person I want on that board by her own choice." The air stopped. It wasn't flirting. It wasn't charm. It was the most stripped-down thing I'd ever heard come out of his mouth, an admission with no safety net, no half-smile, no armor that he wore so well I sometimes forgot it was armor. "You stirred something I thought was dead," he continued, and his eyes didn't leave mine. "I watched you for months, not out of control, not because I distrusted you, because you were the only person in there who never lied to me out of fear. You disagreed to my face, left coffee on my desk without being asked, said truths nobody else had the guts to say, and every time you did, a part of me I'd decided to bury came back to the surface. I felt my throat tighten, not from sadness, from something bigger, something I didn't have a name for, something that lived in the space between relief and the terror of realizing someone truly sees you, not the version you show at the office, not the version that functions and produces and pretends everything's fine, the real version, the one that's afraid, that's tired, that doesn't know if she's doing the right thing. The defenses came down, not all at once, not like a wall crumbling, more like a door opening slowly, creaking, after years of being locked. I stood up. The chair rolled back and hit the wall, but neither of us looked. The distance between us was one step, one single step I'd spent weeks avoiding, and that, in that moment, felt like the most inevitable thing in the world. I was the one who kissed him. His surprise lasted less than a second. His hands found my waist and pulled me against him, with an urgency that told me the restraint of the past weeks had cost more than he'd ever admit. His mouth answered mine with the accumulated hunger of every look in the hallway, every teasing text, every touch that almost happened and was cut short. And I grabbed his shirt as if it were the only solid thing in a world that wouldn't stop shifting beneath my feet. He lifted me without effort, set me on the edge of the desk, and positioned himself between my legs with the ease of someone claiming a place that was already his. The reports I'd been reviewing scattered across the floor, and neither of us cared, because the numbers were no longer the most important thing in that room. His mouth moved down my neck, and I felt his teeth graze the skin just below my ear. Not a bite, just the promise of one. His breath was hot and uneven against my throat, and his hands traveled my back with a mix of firmness and care that made me feel, at the same time, completely safe and completely at his mercy. "Alex," I murmured, and his name came out like a surrender I didn't even know I was offering. "I'm here," he said against my skin, and his voice vibrated against my neck like an electric current. His hands found the hem of my blouse and pulled it up with a calculated slowness that made me arch my body toward him. Every inch of skin he uncovered got the attention of his fingers first, and his mouth after. My shoulder, my collarbone, the space between my breasts, where my heart was beating so hard I was sure he could feel it. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that knocked the ground out from under me, because it wasn't desire, it was reverence. The kind of look a man like Alex Mancini shouldn't have been capable of, and that, precisely because of that, wrecked me more than any touch. "Are you sure?" he asked, his forehead against mine, his eyes so close I could see every shade of brown and amber in his irises. "I'm sure that if you stop now, I'll never forgive you," I answered. He almost laughed. Almost. But his mouth was already on mine before the laugh arrived, and the kiss was the last thread of control either of us was still holding. He laid me down on the desk with a firmness that sent the rest of the papers to the floor. The weight of his body on mine was something I didn't know I needed. Solid, warm, present, like an anchor that kept me from overthinking and forced me to just feel. His hands moved down my body, removing each piece of clothing with an efficiency that told me he knew exactly what he was doing. And every time a barrier of fabric disappeared between us, the air grew heavier and my breathing shorter. When he touched me with nothing left between his skin and mine, I made a sound I didn't recognize, a low, involuntary sound that was born somewhere between my chest and my throat, and that made him pause for a second, not to pull back, but to look, to keep, as if he were memorizing each one of my reactions to replay later. I pulled at his shirt and he helped, tugging the fabric over his head with one hand, while the other never left my body. His chest was exactly what I'd imagined on the nights I pretended I wasn't imagining. Broad, defined, with a thin scar that crossed the left side of his ribs and that I traced with my finger without thinking. He held my hand there, over the scar, and pressed gently, as if telling me that was his too, and that now it was mine. He entered me slowly, so slowly I felt every millimeter, every inch of fullness that made me grip his shoulders and dig my fingers into his skin as if I needed something to hold me together. The sensation was completeness, not just physical, but something deeper, rawer, as if that connection had been built over weeks of tension, of unanswered glances, of interrupted touches, and now finally existed without restriction. "Look at me," he said, and his voice was hoarse in a way that made me obey before I could think. I looked, and what I saw in his eyes, desire, fear, a brutal vulnerability he probably didn't know he was showing, made me understand I wasn't the only one giving myself over. He was too, the man who trusted no one, who had shut every door, who carried the weight of an entire family on his shoulders, was right there, inside me, eyes open and without any armor. The rhythm he set was slow at first, deep, his hips moving against mine in controlled waves that left me breathless each time. But when I wrapped my legs around his waist and pulled him deeper, the control began to crack. His hands gripped my hips harder, his breathing quickened, and the movements became shorter and more intense. The desk creaked softly with each thrust, and the sound blended with our ragged breathing and the noise of papers still falling to the floor. The absurd and perfect soundtrack of two people who had chosen the most unlikely place and the most unlikely moment to stop fighting the inevitable. "Nina," he said my name as if it were the only word he still remembered, his forehead pressed to mine, sweat sliding from his temple onto my face. "I know," I whispered, because I did. I knew what he felt. I knew what this meant. I knew that after this, neither of us could pretend it was anything less than what it was. The tension built until thinking was no longer possible. His body moved with an urgency that carried me with it, and when the wave reached me, I came undone against him with a tremor that ran through my entire body, clenching around him with a force that pulled a deep, guttural sound from his mouth against mine. He followed soon after, his body going taut, and one last deep thrust before he collapsed on top of me with the weight of someone who had finally let go of what he'd been holding. We stayed there, on the office desk, among reports scattered across the floor and the silence of an empty La Courte. His breathing was heavy and warm against my neck, and the weight of his body on mine was something I should have found uncomfortable, but that was, in truth, the safest thing I'd felt in a long time. His hand found mine, fingers intertwined, and he squeezed with a firmness that said more than any word. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were different, more open, clearer, as if something that had been locked away for years had finally given way. "You're not a mistake, Nina," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his mouth so close to mine I could feel every syllable. "You're the only choice I ever made on my own." I put my hand on his face. I didn't need to say anything. The next day, Alex told me, standing in my office doorframe, with that half smile I was starting to collect like rare coins. He'd called the family together, Giancarlo, Tav, Luca, and simply told them that Nina Sorel was his woman. He didn't ask for opinions. He didn't open it up for debate. And from what he told me, the hand holding his coffee cup had squeezed hard enough to leave marks on his fingers, the only sign that it hadn't been as simple as he'd made it look. Giancarlo raised his eyebrows. Luca whistled. And Tav, leaning against the wall, murmured in that dry voice, "Took long enough." Something inside me clicked into place, not like an explosion, like a soft click, the sound of a piece finding the spot where it always should have been. I'd gone back to Dorchester the day after the night at La Corte, against Alex's wishes, since he thought I should stay at the penthouse until the dust settled, but I needed a day in my own space, with my own things, to process everything that had happened before making a decision that didn't taste like impulse. I processed. I decided. And on the last night before bringing some things to his penthouse, I stopped in the middle of the living room and looked at the couch where it had all started, the photo, the wrong message, the knock at the door. I packed a small suitcase with the essentials and stood there for a moment, with the strange feeling of saying goodbye to a version of myself that no longer existed. My phone rang. Soraya. "So, you're dating the head of the Mafia," she said. No greeting. No preamble. "Is this going to end in a toast or witness protection?" I laughed. For real. With my whole body, head thrown back, with the kind of laugh that only comes when all the built-up tension finally finds an exit. And for the first time in weeks, what I felt wasn't fear or confusion or adrenaline. It was peace. A fragile new peace that I held carefully as if it were made of glass, but it was peace. I hung up with Soraya and went back to packing. That's when I saw Alex's phone. He'd come by earlier to help with the bags and left it on the kitchen table, next to the keys I'd be returning to the landlord at the end of the month. The screen lit up. A notification. I shouldn't look. I knew that. I knew it with the same clarity I'd had when the numbers in the books didn't add up, with the same certainty I'd felt when I heard Renan speaking French in the hallway. I shouldn't look because looking meant crossing a line, and I'd already crossed enough lines in the past few weeks for a lifetime. But I looked. A message from an unsaved number. No profile photo, no ID, no conversation history, just one line. "Donna Cecilia lands in Boston on Tuesday." I stared at the screen until it went dark. I tapped it back on, read it again. The tone was short, formal, with no room for a reply. The kind of message that wasn't a heads up. It was a communique. An arrival notice. Not, "Donna Cecilia wants to visit," or "Donna Cecilia would like to come." Lands, as if the decision were already made, and the only thing left was to prepare the ground. I didn't know who Donna Cecilia was. The name didn't appear in any spreadsheet, any report, any record I'd accessed in my months working for the Mancinis. But something about that sentence, the formality, the title, the fact that Alex hadn't mentioned this person in a single conversation, told me this wasn't just any visit. This was someone with enough weight to warrant an unsigned message, and for her arrival to be treated as an event, not a courtesy. I put the phone back on the table, exactly where it had been, in exactly the same position. I finished packing in silence. I closed the apartment door behind me and went down the stairs with the bag on my shoulder and the suitcase in my hand, and when I stepped outside and the cold Boston air hit my face, the peace from 5 minutes ago didn't feel so solid anymore. Tuesday was 4 days away, and I had the feeling, with the uncomfortable precision of someone who reads numbers for a living, that the equation I was putting together in my head wasn't going to balance. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I thought the hardest part had been stepping into his world. I was wrong. The hardest part began when his world decided I didn't belong there. Alex chose me in front of everyone. But the Mancini family isn't the kind of family that accepts choices made outside the right table. Then Donna Cecilia arrived in Boston. No warning, no smile, not the slightest intention of making my life easier. And with her came the only question I don't know how to answer. What happens when the most dangerous man in Boston isn't strong enough to stand up to his own mother? I survived the mob. Now I need to survive the family. And this time, no one's going to save me. As you can see, that was just a little taste of book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments. And the complete book too, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on book 2. And since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.